There was the time we were out in the middle of the San Francisco Bay in a, not very big boat, and the engines died. And that bay has a lot of container ships that can't see you at sunset, even with your lights on. That's fear. We're talking here about business. We're not talking about life and death. My wife's a nurse. When people mess up in that line of work, people die. We're building companies, whether it's software or something else, to help our clients, to help our customers, our consumers, whatever it is. If you mess it up, you'll learn from it. No one's going to die, and you'll be all right.
I kind of want to go through it chronological, Geoff, so people have an idea of the story. But before I do that, you have just finished 20 years of running your software company, which was web services, and we'll get into that. But
really, just like I got 3 innings in that time, three companies down in 2 decades. Different companies, very different. One of them only lasted a year. The other 2 ran, decade or more. So, and a bit of overlap there as well, which is where we first got to meet Adam. It's definitely been exciting and very varied journey. Still always in the kind of tech space, so not really that varied, but still, I think back on the experiences, and it was a lot of miles covered in very different ways.
So what's the feeling like now? I mean, you're a couple of months away from your sale. Like what emotions do you go through, and what does that actually look like for you?
I think it still feels, I don't know if it's an old, sort of Chinese proverb of, feels a little too soon to be sure. Sort of still very much in the moment. The journey of building 3 companies over a couple of decades across multiple continents with global customers in related but different fields was just a grind from the very first day to the very last day. And that's the nature, really, of building companies. There's a lot of excitement in that. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of reward and fulfillment that comes from creating something out of nothing, for beating the odds, for creating opportunities for your team members to really grow as people and professionals, as well as personally my own journey of growth. So there's been a huge amount over that time period. And I didn't really think of it so much as, okay, this chapter's finished and sort of like hanging up the boots type thing. It's not really a retirement play in my mind. And so it feels a little bit like, I don't know, maybe call it halftime at the footy, where there's been, a solid half and a lot of knocks and bruises and a bit of elation and some celebration and a sense of camaraderie. And you're taking a breather. Maybe you're having some oranges and you're thinking about, all right, what am I going to take onto the field for the second half? And how can we, on this type of time scale, take those lessons, those experiences, and apply them in a way that has, to the old Steve Jobs quote, an even bigger ding on the universe type of impact. So it feels like that half time where you're still, running a little bit quick. Your pulse is still up there and you're still breathing with a bit more intensity than you do first thing in the morning. But you also, are not sitting there looking to see which bloke's going to, sort of come out of left field and tackle you, and you're going to be dusted up a bit.
Yeah. So I imagine there's some celebration as well, because it's such a big milestone to achieve, and you've also kept your teams quite close to you. I know you've kept a basic Wollongong with some of your original members, which is so cool to me. So there must be some elation across the teams as well. What's that looking like across the company?
I think it varies person by person. Right. Certainly, the business has gone on to a new chapter now, and I'm not involved in that chapter. Okay. And for some folks, that's, or maybe for many folks, that's really kind of tumultuous or high turbulence period of uncertainty. And I can't speak. I know some people have felt that way. I know others have been kind of excited for a new chapter and a new direction. So there's definitely, individual responses is my sense. And it's not something I've navigated in this way in the past. And I dare say most of the people in the business had, similarly not a lot of experiences in this sort of a play. Those who did have moved, fairly quickly with their decision making, and those who haven't are, sort of maybe, there's no rush on a lot of things in life, really. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's been pretty varied. It certainly felt weird for me not to be on, 4 nights a week of calls with the Aussie team from here in
Yeah.
Colorado in the USA, and not going to the office every day has had its own kind of interesting changes as well. And the thing that I definitely feel and miss the most is those team and personal connections over the time. And it's sort of a little bit funny too, like having sold the company and no longer being involved. I don't kind of want to like put my elbows in there or stick my nose in and be that kind of nosy, curious person who is actually kind of, not making their team's lives easier. So, I'm also trying to be a bit respectful in that way, although
Yeah.
it's definitely a change, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah. So I've always been interested as to where your entrepreneurial spirit came from, where that confidence came from. Did you have a mentor? Is it in your family?
Yeah,
I'm quite interested in that. Yeah.
it's interesting to reflect on it. And like a lot of the time, when you're doing stuff, you don't necessarily give a lot of thought to the why or the background or, trying to piece it together because frankly, you're just on the field. You don't have the luxury to sort of stand around and do much of that. But to give you a bit of an off the cuff answer, because I'm thinking about it now, I wouldn't say for the first time, but certainly with, more introspection than maybe in the past as we're talking. So I grew up son of a high school teacher and a pharmacist. And so very much not that kind of entrepreneurial backstory. And when it came to the things that, you're talking about when it came to uni and asking questions and not being afraid to admit I didn't know something and therefore wanting to get answers. And if they explained it to me and I still didn't get it, I didn't care if I looked like an idiot because I'd rather look like an idiot and then get the answer, like understand it and then move on. Because after all, what's the point of going to, some form of formal instruction from someone who's an expert if you can't actually walk away with the skills or the knowledge?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it came from the fact that Dad being a school teacher when I was a little boy, I would ask him questions and he had just the most incredible amount of patience to answer whatever esoteric question I had. And I was fortunate that his own kind of schooling and education and intellectual curiosity meant that for a long time, any questions I asked, he had the answers to. And when I think about, sometimes with my own kids now asking me questions, if I don't know the answer, there's always Wikipedia. But he didn't have that. Yes, we had Encyclopedia Britannica, but there was no kind of sneaky, sort of opening that bad boy up. You knew when it was being researched, right? So I was lucky that not only was he patient to answer questions and had a bunch of knowledge to give, but he was also really patient to really answer them a second or a third time if it didn't stick. And learning that kind of muscle memory that if you don't know, ask the question. If you still don't know, ask it again. And being in a safe kind of family environment of love meant that then when I was in, the big bad world, I kind of didn't bother me and it never fazed me. And it was interesting in thinking back to those uni experiences where people would come up to me sometimes after class or in the bar. They're like, thank you so much for asking that, man. And they weren't sucking up to me at all. They were being really genuine and vulnerable themselves and going, I didn't get that either, but I was afraid to ask. Well, thank you for asking. I don't know if I would have, but I'm so glad you did because I get it now. And so that sort of rolled the whole way through that I can remember. And then the second piece about the entrepreneurial journey, I think there was a couple of, high school influences, shall we say. Early on in high school, I'm one of 5 boys and coming from a school teacher salary with a part-time pharmacy salary, my parents really just gave everything they could to put food on the table, and us hungry growing boys devoured everything they would give us. So it was always, money was tight. And one of the things that Dad tried to do, realizing that as a teacher he had some flexibility in the evenings, was, okay, what are my options here for adding additional income to the family? And at that time, multi-level marketing was becoming a thing. And so he turned his hand to that and really gave it his all. Like a lot of those businesses, they're not very good. Like the economics aren't actually very good. But if you don't have another choice and, an extra 100 or 200 bucks a month makes all the difference, even though you may have spent 30 hours of your time to try and make that, then you do it. because you
It
need it.
doesn't matter, right? Yeah.
All right. And one of the things the multi-level marketing guys do a pretty good job of is education and motivation through self-paced learning. So they'll provide you, back in the day, this, sort of data both of us made, there was a tape of the week that would come through in the mail. And so we'd go on a drive in the car, and that's where we'd listen to it. And so they'd listen to this stuff, and it was often inspiring. It was almost TED-esque type speeches, stuff that now in the later podcast we're inundated with great options. But this is back in the, I don't know, early 90s to mid 90s. That wasn't nearly as prevalent. And so being able to access that passively and then talk about it as a family, just as out of curiosity, what are they talking about there? And what's Charlotte, North Carolina, and why are they all there, and all this kind of stuff. And they got me thinking about different things that were entrepreneurial, but it was very passive. I wasn't listening to it as like, okay, I've got to get tips on, how to win friends and influence people. But you'd hear about these things. And so then when you're a bit older, kind of the ground's being softened. And so then when I was a bit older in year 11, I did a thing called Young Achievement Australia, YA. And it's this program that I don't know if they run it anymore, which is a real shame. But they basically run things. They get businesses to sponsor and put aside a conference room or some space. We did some stuff with BHP, now called BlueScope. And we got, 3 or 4 schools worth of kids that had some interest in doing this after school. It was cheap as chips. We had to get together. We sold shares in our company for $2 each to anyone we could. There weren't, we were limited on how much capital we could raise. And then we ended up creating satin boxer shorts, which my family members still tell me they wear. I don't have any, unfortunately. I sold them all. I didn't get to buy them. But yeah, I mean, it was great. And we learned about, a P&L, and we learned about, shareholder distributions and dividends, and it was a lot of sales, a lot of marketing. And it was only a short period of time, but it was really energizing. And I just remember coming back from that experience, hard work, late nights, grinding, and thinking, I enjoyed this so much more than anything I've covered in school today. And so that kind of, those two factors, I think, the kind of passive exposure to entrepreneurial, guides and stories, combined with the, little bit of experience with it. They were enough of the things. And I kind of, having started, I basically had been working in various cash jobs before it was legal. And then after it was legal, working in hospitality at the local, sort of fancy hotel, which wasn't that fancy by the scheme of things, but still pretty good at the Novotel there. And I'd sort of, I think, come to realize as well that I was probably on that kind of spectrum of unemployable. And so then when I was in uni and had started to do some freelancing work, as we call it now, and started to have some traction, I decided to go all in, because why not? You don't have anything you're walking away from, and you don't have any dependency you need to maintain. And so, that was the journey to start Internetrix, my first company.
So how did you get so competent in computer technology, and how did you decide so quickly that university wasn't going to fulfill what you needed at that point?
So when I was in high school, this is, mid 90s, computers were starting to become more of a thing. And I was lucky that Dad had an interest in it too. And he would bring his effectively his workstation. It's a big hulking thing. Micro-B, I think, was the first version. And he'd bring it home in the back of the old station wagon every school holidays. And his reason, having cleared it with the principal, of course, was at that time, the incidences of break-ins at schools was endemic, right? So, you could guarantee that second day of school holidays at night, some kids in rat bags would get in and they'd nick all of the AV kit, all the projectors would go, everything, right? Anything you could carry that wasn't nailed down, that had some money, you could sell it at the back of the truck, they'd take it. So anyway, he'd bring the computer home, and then he would let me watch over his shoulder as he was learning how to type, and learning how to do word processing, and learning how to do early versions of Excel and that kind of thing. And his patience for letting me watch over his shoulder. I mean, I think about it with my kids now, and it'd probably drive me mad. But he, saintly patience. And so then as soon as I got a chance, I was in there and tinkering around. And so then when I think it was, I'd saved up enough money from my part-time job, and went down to the local computer store and ended up buying an IBM PC, and we bought it as a family first, and then I burned it to the ground metaphorically so many times trying to learn how it works. Overriding a master boot record is a pretty effective way to learn how master boot record works and why it's important. And so that kind of thing. And eventually it got to a point, actually, we bought one as a family. It got to a point where I broke it too many times. So like, right, that's it. You're forbidden from using this one. You have to take your own money and buy your own because we're sick of you ruining ours. And I proceeded to do that. I saved up, bought my own and tinkered with it. So I'd probably been doing that for, I don't know, maybe 6 years by the time I was at uni, going into my third year of telecommunications engineering, having done computer science and physics and mathematics pretty intensely for those first 2 years as core subjects that you have to do. And I loved some of the maths, not as much, but I loved them. And then I get into the third year, and it became really clear to me that the degree I'd signed up for was really going to set me up to be a middle manager at Telstra. And no disrespect for anyone who's listening to this podcast in the later who's in that role. But I looked at it with my already self-awareness about being somewhat unemployable and thought being a middle manager in Telstra, fighting to live in a certain suburb of Sydney and getting into some keeping up with the Joneses bullshit about which private school to send my kids to, I don't know. I was like, no, like allergic reaction. No, this is not what I want from my life. I don't have a plan, but I know when I don't want something at that time. And so I was like, yeah, I do not want to be a middle manager at Telstra. For any of the Americans listening, it'd be equivalent of AT&T back in the day, or British Telecom, or it just, the traditional monopoly Goliath type, slow moving big company. I was like, no, I'm out. So I tried to switch to a commerce degree just to get the degree done as quickly as possible. I already had 2 years under the belt, and the university said, no, if you want to do that, you got to go back to the beginning, mate, snakes and ladders, and you got to do all these core subjects and start over. And I thought, yeah, I could do that, or I could just defer and start my company and see what happens, which is what I did.
So did you have support from your family and people around you at that time? Like, how hard was that decision, Geoff?
I think because of that mentality of trying to understand things before, sort of being flippant with decision making. So being confident and quick to make a decision, but doing it on the basis of having thought a lot and being kind of, I don't know, understanding the landscape as best as I could beforehand. I didn't really get too much pushback. It also helped that because I'd worked, some of the weeks when I added up the contact time for an engineering degree is at least 40 hours a week of contact time. Whereas my friends who were over in, building 19, any University of Wollongong people will know what that is with a wink and a nudge. They were lucky to get to 8 contact hours a week.
Yeah.
And so we were doing 40 plus. It was intense. And then I was some weeks when I added up my part-time work at the Novotel, I was doing over 100 hours a week. And what I did was took that money and put it into paying for my HECS as I went through. So I got to make that decision with maybe a clearer conscience than folks who'd racked up some pretty serious HECS debt, because I'd like, hey, look, I've paid for this myself. It never became a conversation topic, but I think it was sufficiently implied that, I'm making this decision with a clear eye, and it wasn't just hedonism. It wasn't just like, oh, I feel like doing this now, or I'm going to change to my 5th degree in 8 years, which I've seen friends do. No, it was like, nah, this isn't working for these reasons. And it was helped a little bit because I remember doing the first internet marketing subject, which was part of my attempt to get over to the commerce track. And this poor lecturer shows up in February full of excitement and says, oh, I'm so excited to teach this subject to you all. And we're like, yeah, we're pretty excited too, man. It's like, this is 99 or 2000, 99, I think.
99, that I would have been in that class, Geoff.
Oh, man. And that, I don't know if you remember it, mate, but the lecturer was like, I'm so excited about the internet. I only found out I was doing this subject, teaching this 6 weeks ago. I got a call from the dean, and they told me that the person who was teaching this subject and we'd lined up got a job in Silicon Valley working for Cisco. So he's gone, and they needed me to do it. So I thought, well, I got 6 weeks to get ready. So I've been on a crash course, and I'm excited. And I was like, I'm paying HECS. What? Like, why am I paying for this? Yeah. And the textbook is a real recently updated textbook. It was like for 1996, and this is a 99 class. Well, the amount of stuff that changed in those 3 years is just, it would make your head spin. It's the closest thing I can think of is, some sort of applied AI kind of marketing topic from 3 years ago, and then think about it now, and just like, yeah, okay, how crazy, how fast it's changed. So I was just like, yeah, this is a waste of my time and money. So that also made it a little bit easier to pull the ripcord, because I was just looking up what it was to stay. I went, this is be foolish. This is a bad decision, somewhat self-evidently.
Yeah, I
Mate,
would
most
hope
emperors,
anyone.
have no clothes.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, absolutely. But that's
and
harder to realize than to, it's harder to actually know that than to say it, I think, for people. So I would hope that
I
people
don't
can
know. I
kind of,
wonder if I don't know. My kids are too young to be at this phase, but talking to friends who've got teenagers at the moment and thinking back to my own journey, the rebellious kind of unwillingness to follow the playbook that your parents put down and that the world tells you need to do. I almost feel like it's easier when you're younger, as long as you've got the permission structure to question stuff and think, is this bullshit? Like, does the
yeah,
emperor have no clothes? And kind of, be very willing to form that opinion, but to form that opinion critically, not just like mindless rebellion, because there's nothing
yeah,
quite like a 16-year-old who already knows everything, is there?
It's good to be able to speak to you, Geoff. But when
Yeah,
you talk about rebelliousness,
yeah,
do you reckon that's part of the Aussie approach to things? Because it just seems like Aussies punch above their weight, be it in Hollywood, sport, or in
mm.
the tech field. What is it about Aussies that gives us that drive and that success? And also, if you could just talk about the Aussie Founders Network.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think I don't think we're any more rebellious than anyone else. I think we're probably a little less reverent, and that is helpful in many respects, but it can also be an Achilles heel, especially if you've been socially rewarded for being a bit of a larrikin or speaking your mind. It can reinforce a behavioral profile that, what you don't realize is that, there can be negative consequences if you're not on the nose with something. Um, but I think the kind of irreverence is more relevant than rebelliousness. But I don't think those things are really kind of the key to the success. I've spent a bunch of time when I was living in San Francisco with people from all over the world. And it was interesting that the most common cultural crossover that I perceived was not at all what you'd imagine. It was the Israeli startups that we hung out with, and then the Aussies and Kiwis. And the Aussies and Kiwis, in this respect, we could think of as being one and the same, because they're so much more similar that the differences are best kept, for banter on a rugby field or something. Um, so us kind of Aussies and Kiwis and then the Israelis tended to have similar outsized kind of impacts and a similar disposition, and part of that was an egalitarianism, and that is something that does get talked about quite a bit in the melting pot that is Israel, and the fact that everyone has to do their national service, and there's not a lot of the kind of private school BS that goes on in more established stratified societies. But the other thing that really, I think, explains the ability to outperform is the fact that building a company, or being a great athlete, or being a great actor, or a great musician is a lot harder when you're surrounded, or standing out, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is a lot harder when you're surrounded by other talented people, and where the market is quite small. So the Aussie market, what is it, 24, 25 million people now? If you look at it on a GDP basis, it's like 2% of global GDP. So it's a small population, smaller than Texas, much smaller than California, half the size. And you realize that, frankly, especially when you get out and you live offshore, like I have done now for well over a decade, the world thinks about Australia when they want to daydream about a holiday or vacation, as the Americans say, or when they want to watch something cool on TV about wild animals. Like, it's a pretty, it definitely is something that occupies a big space in people's minds, but it's not an active space. And it's
Right.
more of a social curiosity space. Nobody making decisions in the boardroom anywhere in the world, with the possibility of Singapore, is giving a single moment of thought to what it means for the Aussie market. It's just not, because we don't matter on that kind of global GDP basis. We're also a long way away. So you find yourself in this island environment with a bit of an island challenge that also happens to have a really good and accessible education system all the way up from preschool now through to uni. And that means when you then combine that with an immigration system, which prioritizes smart, accomplished people through the points system that rewards education attainment, you end up with a petri dish, which is incredibly competitive. It has a lot of really smart, really capable, and just talented people. But the spoils to the victor are small if you just stay inside of that one place. And a bit like, I think of it in some respects like natural selection. And the reason that, in Oz, we've got the most dangerous spiders and the most dangerous snakes and the most dangerous this, it's not because they're mean. It's because if they don't get that meal, they're not going to make it. They're not going to survive because there's not a lot of food around in the desert.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a pretty good proxy for the pressures that create outsized global competencies from the Australian community. Now, it doesn't hurt that our language is the business language of the world. It doesn't hurt that we've got the kind of mental space from a cultural point of view that makes people like to talk to us and curious about our story. And at least we've got a position in someone's mind in a classic branding sense with positioning. So those things all help as well. But I think the talent and the execution that comes out is a function of the fact that the place is really competitive and really hard to be world-class at. And a lot of people don't go offshore because it's so good to live there. So you just end up with this concentration that is quite challenging and in some respects kind of professionally unforgiving. And I think that's why we do well. I think it's the same reason the Kiwis do well. And the Israelis, while their reason's different, it's a sense of kind of existential kind of pressure and stress that you'd never feel, sitting on Bondi Beach, as you would sitting on a beach off Tel Aviv. But the fact that it is also incredibly intense and pressured and has smart people who are then given the resources and the encouragement, whether it be education or mission, those things I think are what helps us stand out.
It's really effective to draw a comparison to the wildlife. I think that paints a picture of just how cutthroat it is, and you really do have to work hard to make an impact.
Yeah.
And do you still find even now that there's a curiosity about your accent or because you haven't lost any of your Aussie essence?
Oh, cheers, man.
Like you could be next door by the way you talk. And you've been there for quite some time. So
yeah.
Do you find that there's a little bit of a curiosity about? It could even open a door, I suppose.
Yeah. It can. It's one of those things where standing out is, as long as it's not for something really terrible. Like, damn, that guy's got terrible BO. Like you're remembered, but not in a way someone wants to meet you again. But generally speaking, if you can stand out and be memorable, that really helps. We know how crazy the world of marketing, messaging, and communications. And you go to a networking event, you meet 30 people, and if someone then said you got $1 million if you remember 10 of them. no one would come out with $1 million, right? Like, so anyway, it is helpful to be memorable, and it's a bit of a topic of conversation. It depends very much on where you are. So I remember this story. I was living in San Francisco, very global, cosmopolitan city, accents, backgrounds, whatever. And it wasn't something that was particularly noteworthy, or didn't come up, or wasn't, a second or third question in conversation. There'd be a first or a second, maybe like, oh, when did you get here? Where are you from? And how long have you been here? And then on to the next topic, nothing to do with any of that. And I remember with a friend of mine, he was doing a bunch of business in the East Bay and had one of those smaller regional banks that he was the customer of. And they invited us to go to a social event. And I was basically his plus one. I think he was single at the time. He's like, oh, let's do this thing. It's on the bay. It's on the boat. They're good people. I was like, yeah, cool, mate. I'll come with you. It's one of my grooms, and it's a really close friend. And I remember these people who lived, I don't know, all of 20 or 30 miles as a crow flies from where I lived in San Francisco. You would have thought that my friend and I had just arrived from the moon. They just never hear accents. They never have a story that's interesting. And we, it was just hilarious. Went from being, a non-issue and a non-conversation topic to something that just went on and on and on and on and on. So anyway, it was very sweet of them. So to answer your question, it depends where you are. If you're in a place that doesn't see much international travel or, international people, then yeah, it can still be a pretty interesting conversation.
Just speaking of San Fran and Silicon Valley, do you reckon that's at risk of losing its stronghold as being the centerpiece for? No,
it was wobbly 2 years ago. I mean, the response to the pandemic by San Francisco was true to the form of their general civic leadership. I mean, the place has been snatching defeat from the jaws of victory for decades. It is one of the worst run cities in the United States. And unfortunately, speaking of the self-awareness before Adam, like their sense of how great they're doing as they go around renaming high schools rather than reopening them. Because George Washington kind of had associations with slavery, so we better rename that school. That kind of stuff that they did. And yeah, I know anyone who's listening, oh, that's the school board, that's not the city. I'm just saying collectively, like the civic environment that everyone kind of operates within is one of the worst run in the world, or at least in the United States. I'm sure there's plenty of really messed up places and civil wars and Syria or whatever. But in the US, it's terrible. And so, yeah, they... it almost was enough. Their incompetence and just stupidity was it almost enough to knock the wind not just out of the sails, but maybe to sink the ship. And 2 years ago, when I was in SF, the downtown was like the zombie apocalypse. It really just felt like one of those movie sets. But the place is successful because of the people that it attracts that don't come there at all for the civic leadership. In fact, they come there despite the civic leadership, or because they don't think about it. They just get on with it because that's where a lot of the best minds and the talent and the creativity and a lot of great things happen. And 2 years ago, I probably could have been convinced that its time had come because nothing lasts forever. But I was there for some friends of mine opening a building they bought last August. So that's 8 months ago now, 9 months ago. And it was just like nothing bad had happened in the sense that it was as strong and vibrant as I've ever seen it, maybe more so. Because to be honest, the prior few years was just full of crypto bros and stuff that had no innovation, and it was just a grift one way or the other. And so like when the kind of the bro and the grift and the crypto, and as well as that, like late stage companies that were just like spending money like crazy and not really creating anything valuable, that period from probably 2015, 2016, certainly through to the pandemic, that wasn't SF in its finest either. On paper, it looked great. The price, if you're a commercial property owner, it was the best of times. You were charging a fortune for a C-grade building. But as an innovator, as a founder, as a technologist, it didn't feel as exciting as it did in 2006 or in 2012 through to call it 2015. It started to turn, and now when I'm back there, it feels like it did back in 2012. It's really, really exciting.
Yeah, I thought it had reached its peak when I heard about an app they had to implement that tracked human fecal matter on the streets.
Yeah,
I thought this must be the end of it.
That was before fentanyl, Danny. That was really 2017, I think it was. Yeah, you walk down the street and see poop, and the old question was, is it dog or human? And the joke is, of course, no one who owned a dog would leave it on the ground, right? Like it was clear that it wasn't a dog. So yeah, I mean, it's that was pretty wild, and continued for a while. Still kind of is. I mean,
yeah.
there's lots of places that are pretty messed up. Like you wouldn't go near the Tenderloin, but it's not like it, is presented externally. Those stories are out of date by, I don't know, 2 or 3 years at this point, or maybe I'm
Okay.
seeing the leading edge of the
Yep.
process, and there's still plenty of trailing edge misery, and the city definitely still has lots of problems. It's not sweetness and light, but I'm very bullish on its future.
What is it that makes Silicon Valley what it is? Like, why that geographical location? Is it because it's a bay and it's a place for international?
Started off
Like,
as
why there?
Short version, there's a great writer, Kim-Mai. She's formerly from TechCrunch. She's written some great stuff. She's a Bay Area native, and there's not a lot of those in the scheme of things. It's very much a transient city. She's done some great work and I think written a book about it. But the real short version that I could crib from her research and other things is, first of all, Stanford and University of California, Berkeley. Those are two absolutely world-class institutions, both of which, especially Stanford, have a revolving door kind of mentality to their academics. So instead of being an academic on a tenure track who, as soon as you get your tenure, effectively wall yourself off from anyone who's not in the academic world, at Stanford, they highly encourage, I think to the point of giving them a boot sometimes, their faculty to leave the university on a sabbatical type basis and go into industry. And then they come back in and they go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. It's an incredible interface, osmotic interface, which is what you want. You do not want a moat. You do not want a wall. And so that plays a massive part. And that's been around a long time. The catalyst of Silicon Valley really is, as the name suggests, goes back to Fairchild Semiconductor and the fact that California limited or made illegal non-competes, which has only just been something that the FTC in the US has said they want to do. And we'll see whether the courts allow them to do that across the country. But it meant that the people who were building chips in the early silicon days at Fairchild Semiconductor, which itself came to the Bay Area because of a falling out up in sort of the Northeast around sort of Boston and all of those college towns. There was basically, I think they call it the Traders 8. There's a group of guys who were all the silicon kind of wizards, really didn't like their boss for good reason, by all reports. And they left and started Intel. Just got out of Dodge and started their own company. And then the other sort of the key factor in that time as well was the Cold War was in full swing and the space race was underway. And there was a lot of government money that went into satellites, guidance systems. And I mean, if you're doing hypersonic missiles or ICBMs, you've got to have some pretty fast processing abilities to understand your telemetry and not get lost, because there's no guy sitting on the front of that driving it, right? And so the history of California, but particularly the southern part of the Bay Area around what's now known as NASA Ames and Moffett Field, is a big part of that too. So a lot of money from American taxpayers went into funding critical parts of technology growth because they had an existential need or a real fear in the Cold War. And that led to enough kind of money coming in to create the demand for new technologies. And if you're curious, you can check out a couple of cool things. The history of the little round batteries that you put in your key fobs. The CIA played a critical part in inventing those because they needed to put listening devices in the Moscow embassy. They couldn't get back into it again afterwards. So squeezing every single watt out of those little guys, or millivolt, was pretty special. They had, a lot of cool stuff that they did around, the technology side of things. And the cost of the first solar cell per kilowatt hour was just off the charts. But because it was going on a satellite and they didn't have any other alternatives, they paid it. And that funded those very first kind of cutting edge phases. What then transpired over the following couple of decades is the companies who did that created the future in the 70s and the 80s, had their IPOs, had their exits. The people who had stock in those companies, including the venture capitalists, one of which came out of the Trader S8, I think, in the old Intel days, they went on to have a lot of money. And that money was in the hands of people that were still relatively young. It wasn't multi-generational kind of trusts and all that kind of Carnegie or Rockefeller type stuff. It was people who'd never grown up with any of that. And rather than thinking that they wanted to try and then get into a classic game of assembling as much wealth and as many estates as they possibly can, and keeping up with the Joneses. Again, these are normal, just straight up normal people who love technology. They spent their money investing in the new technology startups. So they became angel investors, and that availability of capital, that was really, the multi-generational thing, which is why the recent transaction for Canva generating millions of dollars for folks in the Aussie ecosystem is such a big deal.
Yeah.
Because ideally, they will then becoming angel investors in the next generation. And that is the catalyst that makes the biggest difference. And so those factors are what kind of really helps. It also probably helps that the Bay Areas, especially San Francisco and Silicon Valley, they're, I wouldn't call them quite a kind of industrial monoculture, but they almost are, in the sense that you make your money in tech and then you invest it back in tech, and it creates a feedback loop that is really quite good at selecting for excellence because people have seen it and done it themselves. Whereas if you're in the Northeast, you could be doing it in biotech or pharma, you could be doing it in real estate, you could be doing it in media, you could be doing it in fashion, all these other industries. Just think about what New York's known for. And I think while the diversity could be a lot of fun and makes for a more vibrant civic community, the ability, like if I, as a guy with an exit, then wants to invest a couple of $1 million into a theater project, there's a decent chance I'm losing my shirt. If I want to invest in real estate, there's a decent chance I'm not going to do a great job. By the way, real estate investments, sucks up a lot of capital, and sometimes it gives people a roof over their head, but it definitely doesn't create the next Google. So the ability to kind of have this investment come from people who understand the game and can then have an outsized influence, not just as the money, but also as an advisor or, an employee or whatever. Those features is what makes it special. So anytime you hear, we want to try and replicate Silicon Valley, it's like, okay, you got to have 2 of, the world's top 20 universities. Have you got that checked? Okay, that could be a challenge. Maybe you do. And then
step 1.
and then do you have call it a 30 to 40 year track record of startups having some success in a nascent field with money going into them from a customer point of view who's willing to buy, in this case, the US government, and the exits from those proven to be plowed back in over and over and over again. So whenever you hear someone who goes, we want to create a Silicon Valley, so we're going to start by building it in industry park. And it's like, I hope you're not taking taxpayers' money for this, because we know how this movie ends.
Yeah. And taxpayer money doesn't have the same intelligence built in as former.
Although sometimes it can. Like if you look at DARPA, which is the background of the internet that we all use and we're talking over today, like they funded experimental projects with a relatively light touch because they knew they were funding the front end of the leading edge, right? And no one was going to lose their job, so to speak, for backing a project that failed by an interesting research team.
So there wasn't the risk.
My friends in academia now, they need to fill in all these applications to try and get their things funded.
Yeah.
And you can just see that the other side of the table who's assessing this stuff is like, okay, so let's make sure this isn't going to get anyone fired. Has got all the boxes ticked required to do the compliance checks to make sure that it's not going to embarrass our minister, who may well be from a different government by the time we announce this thing. Like, that explains.
Yeah. Compliance and bureaucracy can bog down the process for sure.
And that's one of Australia's biggest challenges, man, the nanny state. Like I was back there for the better part of a month not long ago, and I was just reminded, I'm like, oh, man, there's so much nanny state, and sometimes it's good. Like you want to be able to drink water. You want to be able to drink water out of your tap without worrying.
It doesn't help innovation though, does it? Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. If it sticks to stuff that's really, important, but I think it also becomes, as Oz, we kind of get what we deserve in some respects. When something goes wrong, the first question you often hear is, well, what's the government going to do about it?
How
can the government stop this from happening again? It's like, mate, it's bad luck.
Yeah.
Like bad luck
Yeah.
happens.
You can't legislate bad luck out of the equation.
No, you can't. And you probably can't legislate stupidity. Like if you want to legislate
Yeah,
out
exactly.
stupidity, then
Yeah.
you are going to end up with such a nanny state that no one can ever fall over or graze their knee.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
Well,
helps you
even
to ever learn how to run fast. Probably not.
those little button batteries that you're talking about, there's
Yeah.
a law around that here. And even restricting that can stifle innovation if you
Yeah.
can't use a component.
Yeah. So anyway, that is something I think deserves a bit of introspection. But you know, there's lots of places for those challenges too, right?
I speak to a lot of business owners in various markets and different people, and a common theme that comes up in these conversations is often fear. How did you deal with that, and what are things that you learnt about that particular challenge and on your journey?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to give advice around that kind of stuff because I don't know, for anyone who's ever learned to ski, you know you're going to fall over a bunch when you're learning. Like my first day on the mountain was absolutely miserable until the very end of my very last run, when I finally did what could barely be described as a parallel turn and didn't eat it. And I was happy. I was so happy. I went home to the hotel in Ginny, so happy that night. But for that entire day, it was absolute freaking misery. And then I went back and did it again. And I got better and I'll get better. And then you reach a point where you're now competent, not confident, competent enough that when you come around a corner, if you need to stop, you can. If you need to turn, you can. If something comes out of the blue that you're not expecting, or you've never been down this way before, you can handle it. Now, the faster you go, the more reckless you are, the bigger the chances you can't handle it. It's hence the saying of getting out ahead of your skis, right? But I think if you can be self-aware of your competence and then be willing to always be trying to get that little bit better day in and day out from a competence point of view, it can help to manage that or eliminate that fear. Because when you get to that level, and obviously the better you get, the faster you can go, the steeper terrain you can handle. But I think my point of that analogy is a bit like in business, or my reason for thinking about that when I think about answering your question is I wasn't really afraid ever. There were points that sucked. There were points where I fell down and it sucked. And I got back up and kept going. But I felt like I could handle what was going to happen next. And continuing to ski, continuing to get back up again, and continuing to go out again the next day. I think that was really the key. I think about the things that, you know, when I think about fear, there were things that I was in a situation where I really didn't think I could handle whatever happened next. You know, there was the time we were out in the middle of the San Francisco Bay in a, you know, not very big boat, and the engines died. And that bay has a lot of container ships that can't see you at sunset, even with your lights on. That's fear, because you can't necessarily handle what comes next. So you try and make the best decisions you can. But I think for most of the journey, fear was not a prevalent feeling that I felt I needed to manage, because I was confident, because I wasn't getting too far past my competence, that it was all right. And that's where I think that is partly the answer to that question about, you know, what if this bad thing happens, or that bad thing happens, or that bad thing happens? It's like, well, you know what? You've got enough, you know, brains in your head, and no one out there is perfect. So, all right, back yourself to be able to work out how to get through it. And the worst case, and we're talking here about business, we're not talking about life and death. My wife's a nurse. You know, when people mess up in that line of work, people die. We're building companies, whether it's software or something else, to help our clients, to help our customers, our consumers, whatever it is. But I think being a little bit realistic as well about what's at stake, and knowing that if the business completely fails and you lose your house and it's absolutely catastrophically shit, you'll still be able to get up again the next day. And if you built it once, you can build it a second time in half the time with a lot less risk, because you've learned how not to take that turn on the blue run. It was a pretty nasty fall you took. Maybe you needed to go out in a stretcher, having lost your house and having to start all over again. But you've still learned, as long as you can get through your rehab and get back on the hill. So I would say a couple of that generally, be confident in your competence, as long as you're not lying to yourself, and fake it till you make it is a dangerous, dangerous world. And then being prepared to continue to be realistic that if you mess it up, you'll learn from it. No one's going to die, and you'll be all right.
Perfect. That's so cool, Geoff. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And congratulations. All the best to you and your family. And yeah, mate, if you're ever out this way, I'd be keen to grab a beer with you.
Yeah, sounds great, mate. Great to meet you, Danny. Thanks again, Adam.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot, Geoff.
Have a good one, Geoff.
Later. Okay.
Catch you later.